we're going to shift gears a little bit to do the final session of this track. And I really appreciate everyone sticking around. Again, if you have any questions that I didn't answer, I will try and peek on the Discord later, or you can just reach out to me, feel free. So with that, I'm going to bring the panel on. Welcome, panelists. This is, by the way, this is a panel about what tools all game developers should have at hand at all times, just so you know.
Hey, Kate. Hi, everyone.
Hi, how's everyone?
Good, how are you?
Good.
So first, I got to say that's a really abrupt transition to the new panel, but that was an incredible talk. And some of the topics, like you said, are definitely on the controversial side. And I think it takes some bravery to make the comments that were made, but very fascinating. I loved it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, normally a talk like that would have shown up in the global trends track, but unfortunately for this version of PGC, global trends was happening when like at 2 in the morning my time, and I wasn't willing to wake up. So anyway, let's get into this topic about those essential tools that every developer should have. Why don't we just kind of go down the line and start with an introduction? If you could introduce yourself and let us know who you're with, maybe the years in game development, anything else you want to add there. So how about we'll, at least on my screen, I'm going to go on my screen. Let's start with Tadhg.
Hello. Yes, I'm Tadhg Kelly. I have been in, I'm a game developer. I've been in games for 20 years, I think, give or take. And I worked for about 10 years in the UK. I know a lot of the folks from sort of the 2000 scene. I used to work in places like Lionhead and stuff like that way back when. And I've been in the US for about 8 years doing similar sort of work. Most recently, I was at Magic Leap for a stint as a kind of external producer. And I'm currently a freelance kind of design consultant doing a lot of stuff on mobile games.
Great. And Randy?
I co-founded one of the first iPhone gaming companies back in 2007 called Gerbo. Sort of our claim to fame was we had 14 of the first 100 free launch titles on the App Store. That company pivoted to become the large ad network Ad Colony. And I started this company, Lucid Side, in 2000, well, about 6 years ago. And the idea was to do development of video games, an independent game studio on frontier platforms. So we've done stuff with NFTs. Last couple of years, we've done stuff in VR, AR before that. And most recently, we acquired the multiplayer game engine Calisius, which is a open source JavaScript multiplayer game engine. And that's sort of why I'm on this panel, for interest in tools for developers.
Excellent. And Mikhail?
Everyone, my name is Mikhail Akreshashev. I've been in game development since maybe I was 12 years old, playing with QBasic, making text adventure games on my dad's computer. But admittedly, my career is actually in software security and reliability. So I started off my career by making tools for Intel and NASA to find vulnerabilities and bugs in their mission critical source code. More recently, I joined Irdeto to work on a secure operating system for vehicles. And during this project, they acquired Denuvo, which is the leading security provider for the games industry. And that was a great opportunity to merge my hobby of game development and my career experience in software security. And today, my primary responsibility is leading Denuvo's anti-cheat product, which aims to catch cheaters in multiplayer games.
Great. And finally, Juan.
Hi there, my name is Juan Gril, and I have worn many different hats in the game industry. I've been a game designer for many, many years. And in the past few years, I have switched back into development. In the middle of it, I own a game studio for 12 years and I run it, which meant having to be from the CEO to business development person to HR to game designer to producer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And lately, the past 3 years, I've been mostly working in augmented reality development, not just for games, but also for tools.
Excellent. Well, great. Well, obviously, we're talking about the most essential tools. I'm just curious to get started. Basically, one of the things that we know just on a higher level is getting teams to use tools at all. And I know in my days at Microsoft, when I was there, it's like I heard the frequent echoes of frustration from the tools team about they made this great thing and nobody uses it, and they can't get anyone to notice it. So I'm curious about what would your advice be on how do you champion tools within teams, or especially either that and or how do you justify expenses for tools, like basically shoveling money towards tool creation versus adopting something externally.
Yeah, I'll jump in for this one. This is where I would play that gong from Inception that goes boom. It's really all about getting the team on board with using the tool in the first place. It's very hard to force feed a process onto someone. The team really has to be on board. And with that comes with a lot of storytelling, maybe a lot of prototyping to really show the value of the tool in the first place. And I think if they truly buy in, then you don't have the resistance and they start to pull to adopt those tools. I think one of the things that helps this process is really making it easy to adopt. I think a lot of the friction really comes from either learning curves or frustrations with how easy the tool is to integrate or adopt. So I think usability is a big factor of it.
I mean, yeah, and for me, I've had the experience a few times before, especially more in my early career, but it still happens quite a lot of what they call building the rocket ship while you go to space. At Lionhead, for example, it was exactly like that when we worked on the movies all of a zillion years ago. We had a whole kind of scripting engine that was used to kind of wire animations together in order to be able to build scenes, so people could use these to like build their own movies and stuff like that. And that tool was in development a lot of the time during the course of actually building the game, which of course meant you ended up doing one of two things. Either you ended up sort of creating a lot of content in anticipation that it was going to work one way, and then of course things didn't quite work out that way, or you would end up sort of making a lot of like on paper plans for what you think it's going to do, but like when XYZ works, and then when XYZ actually comes along, maybe it's implemented in a different way that you thought it was going to, or it's buggier than you thought it was going to be, or stuff like that. So tool readiness is a hugely impactful part of game production. Right, it can really kind of push your schedule out like 30, 40%, 50% sometimes if the tool itself is not in place, and you get a lot of essentially kind of rushed, crazy, crushed work. It's a lot of reason why people have crunch, for instance, those kinds of things. While they're just trying to sort of essentially make the thing work at all. Rather than all at once. So readiness, commerciality, if it's available in public, if it's a thing that other studios can use, and therefore there's sort of use cases, there's wikis that are available that you can sort of go and find documentation for how to actually implement properly, like all those kinds of things. They're all major risk reducers, and often kind of help you sort of get to where you want to be a lot more easily than maybe back in the day type of stuff.
I like it when tools have for my teams with a batteries included type component where they can see projects that are implemented, because there's nothing a developer likes better than to see something similar than what they were going to implement already fully developed and documented. On the cost, back to your cost question, it almost should always be a major cost savings when you use tools correctly, because there's nothing more expensive than the human resources part of game development. And because it's a creative endeavor, you can literally throw infinite human resources at it. So we're sort of specialized in multiplayer, and one of the biggest insidious costs of a multiplayer game is the DevOps, where game developers don't get into game development because they want to run DevOps. They get in because they want to make bitchin' games and design super cool levels and stuff, and then they get to sort of the point where they have to scale and worry about security and cheating, and all that stuff. And then all of a sudden DevOps goes from being a sort of second-class citizen to a first-class citizen. And that's where, the right tools and the right sort of setup from the very beginning saves you a lot. Because, at the end of the day, that DevOps engineer is going to cost you 150 grand a year.
Yeah, and from my perspective, there's two rules in terms of tool development that I always use. Number one is, what tool can we actually extend to do the job of the tool we want, instead of building one from scratch, right? Let's exhaust all possibilities of searching for open source tools or existing tools that have SDKs for extensibility, so we can use one of those, and that way minimize the impact of the tool development. And number two is does the output of the tool provide a verbose version of the code, so we can go and read what the tool output, and that way we can more easily find issues that the tool might have, because tool is constant development, and as my peers mentioned, they are not foolproof. They're not a commercial product. There's internal development, and usually goes along the way of the development of the game. So if it doesn't produce an output that I can easily read, then it's harder to find a bug that the tool might have created, right? So those are like my two key components in order to pick what tool and how we're going to extend it. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, because I know we all know many, many different types of tools that we've used over the years. I'm curious if you have any examples, positive or negative, tools that you've seen use exceptionally well, that have really, really made a huge difference in optimizing the team and the production schedule or whatever else might be, or any anecdotes about tools that were not used very well, or they were used in a way that was never intended, but it still kind of worked.
I think the classic example I see over and over is game development studios using headless Unity or headless Unreal for their game server, and a lot of that's just because that's what the development team's familiar with, and that's fine at a small scale. But those are very game engines are very heavy memory wise, and CPU usage. So when the game scales, they end up in a world of pain on the cost side, because again, it worked with 50 people playing, but they made that decision early on, and it was a trade-off. And oftentimes tools are a trade-off of like, what does the team know how to use versus what is necessarily the best tool. Our Calisius game engine, just to throw it out there, is an open source, has a 20 megabyte footprint on its JavaScript. So if you're going to make the game development, yes, you may not be familiar with that game engine, but it may be that multiplayer engine, but it might be worthwhile sort of exploring what's going to pay off down the line versus what's easy to develop right today.
It's often, one of the tools that I've often seen studios use, for example, if they're trying to design their narrative out or something, is to go to like a really basic engine like Twine, something where it's just really simple for them to just kind of, map out what it is their content is going to try and do, and kind of understand the structure of what it is they're sort of working on before they get into kind of the very expensive and sort of extensive sort of actual kind of implementation or that kind of stuff. I know the guys who built That Dragon Cancer, for example, I think that's exactly what they did. Numinous Games, they just like wrote the entire thing out in like just the most basic little kind of Twine apps you could possibly find type of thing, as a way to figure out what their story was going to be, because they knew every single scene was going to be different and almost essentially a different kind of mini game. And Ryan cared a lot about making sure that the story itself actually really kind of came through, because it was very personal to him. And so as I understand it, that was the general kind of approach that they took, and it worked well, because it just makes everything very editable and cheap to throw away in a sense, if it's not working or those kinds of things.
I just have sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's what I meant. I was just going to say, it also depends on an engine or what you're using, but since we're mentioning 2D game development, for example, there's two tools that I'm pasting on the chat that are like really great tools because they're extensible, and they can with the right code and the right extensions, they can really serve your purposes. One is called Tadhg, and it's a level editor, but it has a full extensibility in terms of UI, but also in the output, the JSON file that it generates. It's really, really useful for 2D game development, and it can be integrated with any of the engines at the end of the day. And then Texture Packer to make your sprite sheets. So those would be the two tools I use for 2D game development. There's other tools for 3D and as well, but I want to give time to other people to talk.
I'm really happy you mentioned Tiled, because that's one I use just for prototyping and developing in-house, and using it between Unity, Unreal, Godot is so seamless, really fun tool. I had a really quick story for you guys that I think is entertaining about one of the unexpected consequences of using one of our tools. So we offer a piece of middleware called Denuvo Anti-Tamper, whose whole purpose is to prevent piracy of PC game titles. And in the early days of the solution, we're kind of looking at experimental ways to fight piracy. And one of those ways was maybe we don't prevent pirated copies of the game from running, but instead they result in games running in sort of a demo mode. We can't progress part of a certain point of the story or gameplay if a pirated copy is running. And the first game to implement this feature was Batman Arkham Asylum. And what they did was prevent Batman from jumping over a certain pit because he couldn't jump high enough after you played a game to a certain portion in the story. And the unexpected consequence is their support forums were flooded with thousands of people saying, hey, there's a bug in your game. I can't progress past this point. Batman can't jump over the pit. And eventually one of the devs now had a really famous quote that says, it's not a bug in the game's code, it's a bug in your moral code. And as you can imagine, to date, not very many games are using this feature because they realize this is a great way to get thousands of support tickets.
Yeah. And bad ratings on Steam.
Yes.
Yeah,
That reminds me of the I think it was the UX folks on I think it was Halo 4, if I remember right, when they created the heat map tool to understand where the players are actually going on their map.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was that example where right when the map starts, there was a little hill right here that was just part of the environment. It had nothing to do with the game. You're supposed to go this way. You just ignore this. It's just a little hill. But they found that just because like one bush was not there, it made it look like a path. So they found there was this huge heat bloom right at the beginning of the map, and they could not understand what the hell is going on. And then, of course, they look and everyone keeps trying to jump up on this little hill. And they're just like, no, just go that way. So then but of course with the heat map, they're like immediately they can see that, and that tool works really well for them. Well, I'm curious then, you know, in terms of, you know, essential tools, like Juan posted a couple there in the chat. I'm curious if others have what you consider to be like, what are some of like the most essential tools that you would see? Now, of course, this could break out between like, it depends if you're an artist or a programmer or whatever else, but I am kind of curious what you would think for yourself. What would you see as the most important tools that you use, perhaps?
I think it's also important to discern the different stages of your game. So like, for example, the tools for ideation are different from the tools for development than the tools for live operations, right? So we can talk about sets of tools for the different, like we were just talking about tools for development, but for the ideation, it really depends on how your mind works best, particularly for myself. One thing that I've been doing in the past, I used to write GDDs from the beginning, and now I added an initial step, which is, I call it the idea board. And I use a tool called Affinity Designer, which is very similar to Adobe Illustrator. And what I like about starting with a vector-based tool, where I can quickly copy and paste images from the internet, and I start dragging things around, and I start creating arrows and paragraphs around it. It's like I create this mind map, but it's an illustrated mind map, and that's how I come up with ideas for gameplay mechanics, for features, for functionalities, and I create many of these. Sometimes I create one that keeps growing, but then I think about the vector-based format. It's like you can zoom in, out, right, and focus on one specific area, and it works really well for me to ideate. And then depending if I work with a bigger team, I start writing a specification out of that, and that's in a more traditional game design document format written in Google Docs. So I start taking parts of the idea board and even sometimes creating snippets of the images and write them in Google Docs, accompany those images with paragraphs, and that's how I ideate. There's another tool called Miro. I'm going to write them down while people talk, write the links. Miro is actually pretty nice. It's not as easy to use for me than Affinity Designer. Affinity Designer is more powerful, so I can do things faster. But it's true that Miro allows you to make arrows in a more seamless way. I'll break them down while people talk.
I often use, it's a little old school at this point, but I often use Balsamic as a wireframing tool still, because I don't know, I just find it super simple to navigate around. And if I want to try and, particularly if I'm working with a client who needs like a bunch of design work for a spec for something, I was doing a bunch of this only a couple weeks back. It's by far the fastest and in many ways most communicative way to just kind of go, well, what exactly are we talking about? And just go, so you mean a button here that does a thing that does a thing that causes this to happen? Is that what we're actually talking about? Rather than sort of getting lost in theoretical discussions. Sketch and similar, same thing. It's just like ways to be able to kind of visualize and expose ideas, kind of bring them up to the level where people can actually like feel like they're walking through something and therefore kind of understand what they think it's actually doing, and that kind of stuff can really help to save a lot of time and a lot of kind of, you know, churning and thrashing particularly during the early part of a project. Really kind of get you to the point of understanding what it is you're trying to do. So.
What's the panel's thoughts on maybe the essential tool to me, and that's continuous integration? It seems like whenever setting up a project, the first thing I would probably force on the team, not even to ask their opinion, is we need a CI system. I don't care what it is, it's just got to be something. So before we even talk about editors, code styles, anything like this, it's CI from day one, and make sure the project revolves around that.
Yeah, CI/CD. I mean, I think that this is also like, you know, this is obviously a tools panel, but tools and SaaS offerings are kind of bleed together. I mean, they're basically just doing the job that a human would have done in the past, for the most part. And you know, that the CI/CD couldn't agree more that that's a, you know, this critical part of modern development. And that kind of gets into sort of like, does the cloud provider you're using have that as an offering? Because, you know, let's face it, you know, at the end of the day, most of these, you know, especially multiplayer games, are going to be hosted on the cloud somewhere.
I was going to joke and say, I think we can all agree that the tool that everybody actually uses is a spreadsheet of death in Excel.
Or Jira, equally scary.
It's the high watermark of efficiency. Whatever tool you're using has to be better than an Excel spreadsheet, right?
Google spreadsheets, man. I swear to God, like with so many studios where it's like, yeah, we have it all in, our game is in a spreadsheet, and then it opens up into this 48 tab, 50,000 row kind of thing. You're like,
and we're talking about kind of the ideation to you know, kind of perfecting the game, getting to fun, and to you know, deployment. And in a best case scenario, you pick tools that you can use you can reuse what you've developed in the ideation into the development, and then once you know, you've gotten to the fun point, you can actually deploy it without having to rip it all apart. Because, you know, at the end of the day, yes, you can do that, but again, you're just pushing up on time. And so, you know, I like sometimes instead of just fully baked tools, just open source frameworks, you know, that are more of like, you know, the outline of what you want to do, that, you know, basically the developers can go in and make it what they want, because games are just so different. Like every game is so different that there's no one tool that fits every single type of game. And that's why there's 50 game engines, right? There's Cocos, Unity, Unreal. They all have these, you know, specialties. Like Cocos, for example, is not as popular in the US, massively popular in China, like massively popular. It's because it compiles so small. It'll run on a toaster. Whereas, you know, Unity, Unreal just, you know, release these 200 megabyte games, which we've become accustomed to in the US. Is not a big deal, but that's a deal breaker in China, India, Philippines, Vietnam, huge markets.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing I think that's kind of important and often not talked about well is there is a tendency for teams sometimes to sort of fall into like tool drift, you know, where it's like they kind of find a tool that kind of does the thing, but it's not perfect. And then it, like, rather than kind of sticking with it type of thing, they're always like, well, what's this new one? What's this new one? What's this shiny tool? What's this shiny tool? And it can become a real source of sort of friction in a project kind of all by itself, just like this kind of tendency to kind of follow whatever is the new sparkly toy, because there's always a new sparkly toy. There's always a new engine. There's always a new tool. There's always a new project management tool. There's always kind of whatever. And for me, it's over the years, it's become a real mark of, I think, maturity in a studio if they actually are working on things that are, say, 2 years old, right? Things that are actually stable and they know how to use. Whereas if I run these studios where it's like, if they're jumping on whatever was just released last week, usually it means they're going to be kind of risky to work with, or they're going to have a lot of unforeseen issues that'll kind of crop up, or things that they just didn't anticipate, or that kind of thing. So yeah, so it's worth sort of mentioning. Tool maturity is actually important.
Yeah, that's actually a great point you raised, because I know that I've seen a lot of teams where there is that friction. Oh, well, there's those two parties, one who wants to chase this shiny new thing because it is the shiny new thing, and those who basically are like trying to figure out what the hell was introduced 2 years ago and they still haven't figured it out. But I'm wondering if you have any advice, like if you're on a team and you're using a tool now and maybe you're conscious of the fact that it does 60% of what we want it to do, but it doesn't do everything we really would like it to do. How do you know when it's time to switch? Like what are the signs that it's like, okay, I think we do need to go for the shiny new thing?
For me, I think it's always, is there a thing that you're trying to do that the old tool just simply cannot do, right? That it just is fundamentally unable to address without an inordinate amount of work? Or is it just you don't like it? Do you know what I mean? That is it kind of a pain in the ass, but actually you can't make it work kind of stuff. If it's the latter, then you probably shouldn't switch, honestly, because there's so much that you're taking on when you decide you're going to learn a whole new system, or you're going to like a whole new philosophy of working, or all of those kinds of things that will introduce a lot of drag in your schedule and will actually compromise an awful lot of your ability to release in ways that you cannot foresee. And so that's kind of like, stick with the old stuff if it's just kind of annoying. But if it really fundamentally doesn't do the thing, if you have to like literally end up spending 10 times as much work trying to get it to do something just because, but there's like a new tool that just does the thing, then that's when you probably try and make the switch and kind of eat the pain, and kind of go from there. Anything else is just sort of like, it's kind of like, what are you doing kind of stuff, it's too much risk. Yeah.
A lot of times with programming, you don't know how it's going to work until you plug it in and see how it actually flies. So it's kind of sometimes you just have to test it out, and if it starts to not work, you got to punt quick, fail fast. And like try the tool out for, give the engineer a week to kind of get it going. If it's not looking good, read the tea leaves and kick it back.
Tool drift really does happen in really unexpected places. Like our organization brought in Zoom as a video conferencing tool, and our primary communication tool was Slack, but Zoom just happens to have a chat as part of its feature. And some people start using the Zoom chat instead of the Slack chat. And it's not like the whole organization is drifting there, but it's caused enough fragmentation where you're going, why are you drifting to Zoom chat? Was Slack not good enough?
Yep. Project management tools are a demon for that. Like particularly people, being very used to using, say, Jira, and then somebody gets really into using Monday.com, and then somebody else like really likes using something else, and then the CEO really loves to use something else instead, and suddenly you have like this multiplication of what are essentially all these tools that are doing the same thing, which is just tracking what the hell is going on. But and with different things and different ranking systems and different philosophies and different like completion stats and stuff. And the poor producer ends up like crying because they're just like, I spent all day long just translating this to this and this to this, and ends up keeping a big Google Doc because that's all that actually works. So.
Well, I'm glad you guys brought up Excel, because I know like for those of us who work in the localization and culturalization space, that has been like the bane of our existence for years, because, I think every translator will tell you when like, hey, we want you to localize this content. Yo, that'd be great. Send me the bill. Oh no, here's the spreadsheet with all the strings on it. You have no context for who's saying it, when they're saying it, why they're saying it. We're just going to give you a bunch of strings. So I've been a part of that frustration for years. And fortunately, there have been some shining moments, like when I worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider. Crystal Dynamics did this awesome God tool. So basically I could go into any build and just fly around in this kind of, this superwoman version of Lara, and basically see anything I want, look at things. I could see everything in context. It was just amazing. But then of course, when I worked on Ninja Gaiden 2, the Team Ninja said, no, that's against our values. We don't have cheat modes in anything, not even for testing. I'm like, okay. So one thing I'm curious about too is we're talking about a lot of stuff that exists now, but I'm wondering what you see on the horizon that's coming. Is there anything, what are those shiny new objects that we're seeing that may be really useful? Maybe they haven't gotten wide adoption yet, but is there anything that you see coming down that's either stuff that we know about or stuff that you think we need that doesn't exist yet?
Yeah, I talking about the spreadsheets and coming up. Last year, I worked on a project that the team used Airtable. I'm gonna write it down because Airtable is like a spreadsheet with a combination of a database. So every field is connected to a database, can be easily queried, and you can very easily create views of that data in different shape or forms. And what was really cool about the work that one of the developers was doing was he was pretty much providing different views to different people of the team of the exact same data. So when somebody would with the right access would modify that piece of data, it would be modified across all the other views. So localization people had the strings in a view, but those were already part of the system, and everything in Airtable was exported right into the system. So I thought that that was a very interesting way of working with different people in different capacities. And it is a tool that I'm looking forward to integrate again in some other project.
I like JavaScript. Obviously, it's a sort of something we've based our company around. But I have to say, there's a lot of game engines that are built around JavaScript now that have gotten really good. And obviously, Unreal and Unity are the alpha predators of game engines. But in particular, Coco's again not popular in the U.S., but their 3D game engine has really made progress toward being a legitimate Unity competitor. There's open source HTML5 game editors like Phaser. Yeah. And the reason I throw that out because there's the AAA games, there's the AA games, and then there's the vast majority of game developers who are making independent games. And sometimes starting out on the web is not a bad place to start. Starting out with a HTML5 web game to kind of perfect the game loop, see if people like it, especially again multiplayer. The easiest way to get 50 people playing your game simultaneously or 100 people playing your game simultaneously is via, a web game on Poké. So, versus you throw it on the App Store, you got to buy those installs. It's a super expensive grind. So anyways, the HTML5 open source game engines, I'd say those are tools are a good place to start with. And they've gotten to the point where if you get something that works, you can easily export it to iOS and Android.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you mentioned Phaser because I actually worked with Phaser last year and the year before, and I was super pleased with the result. In fact, I think it's probably the best 2D game engine out there, and it's open source. And like you said, you could put it on the web, iterate, and then create the mobile SKUs. It's really, really good.
What do you guys think of Amazon's whole move to turn its engine into an open source platform?
I mean, to be determined. Yeah, I mean, it's usually when projects go, usually if they don't start open source and they kind of go open source, it's oftentimes a graveyard, but we'll see. I mean, I'm hopeful. I mean, look, as much open source, I mean, I guess in the one sense, it's good that those tools can be taken, but if open source is not continuously updated, it just becomes obsolete quickly. And dies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I was going to say one of the areas that I had some amount of contact with in terms of tool development recently is there's a ton of work going on in the AR VR world to try and make just a variety of things to help set up your AR app like easier, like everything from kind of kits to SDKs to like location SDKs to like a lot of different stuff like that. Most of it's super formative still. Some of it, like Unity has some of its kits that are set up, and there's a variety of kind of somewhat maintained kind of like toolkits that are trying to do the same thing. It will probably all settle down over the next kind of year or two. And I think the hope is pretty much to be able to have essentially kind of an XR engine that works, that's good, that's usable, and allows a lot of people to kind of create their kind of XR content fast and be able to deploy it quickly and all that sort of stuff. So it's a big area to keep an eye on.
Maybe to identify a trend instead of a specific tool. So as a middleware tools provider, there's always a friction between providing tools that integrate at a source level, because at this point you need people to read documentation integrate the APIs, maybe put an SDK somewhere that you have to keep up to date, deploy all this stuff on build machines. But as a reward, you really get the full depth of integration where you can do whatever you want with it. And then the complete opposite extreme is you integrate at a binary level, where you take an assembled executable, you decompile it, insert whatever you need, and recompile it. And at this point, no developer intervention is required, and it's completely on autopilot. But compilation is really a lossy process, and you do lose a lot of that context that you might have had at a source level. But nowadays, pretty much everything is going through this intermediate LLVM representation, where you have a pseudo-compiled version of your source code and intermediate representation, which later on then gets compiled for your target architecture. And if you look at something like code being pushed to the PlayStation or Android, where LLVM is the first step in this process, and essentially we're on the cusp of a tooling revolution where you really can begin doing these integrations that are fully automated and don't require any developer input. And at the same time, you don't lose anything that you would get from a source level portion. And the most beautiful part of it is LLVM as a universal representation. So if you wrote, let's say, a source code obfuscator for LLVM, you can then apply it to C#, C++, JavaScript, wherever you want, as long as you went through this intermediate process. And I really think Sony, Orbis compiler, and the PlayStation were way ahead of this. Apple's already on the ball because you no longer submit your compiled game code to the Apple Store. You now submit the intermediate representation, and they can compile it for you before publishing. And I think every platform will move to this kind of mentality in the future.
That's great. We do have a question that has come in from the audience. It says, Randy, you mentioned ideation. What does the panel think about ideation tools such as Ludo.ai?
Panel's Googling Ludo.
Just looked into it. I have no
sounds
idea.
Good. Sounds great.
No idea. Never seen it.
I don't know either. I think it's the ideation part. Like I go back to as I think, again, stylistically, but as much as you can use tools that the ideation phase can continuously go into the development phase without having to rip everything apart, is always the best if you can do it.
Yeah, I know sorry, go on. The machinations team for years has been sort of working on this tool in the background to be able to say model out like game mechanics or game economy or that kind of stuff. And in the last 2 years or so, it feels like they've actually really tried to turn it into a product. So because it was essentially Yaris's kind of sort of baby for a very long time, but it seems to have kind of maybe either changed ownership, or I'm not familiar with the backstory, but it seems like it's different people now. And its idea about being able to kind of, model out the system that you intend to deploy in your game, not like the actual engine, but sort of the system itself, like how it will behave, what you think will happen when users interact, how the economy will pass tokens around, stuff like that, is actually very powerful. It's not well understood by a lot of developers yet, but it is it can be something that really helps you sort of see something in a game that you don't otherwise see once you're kind of halfway through, tearing it apart or like putting code together or like that kind of thing. So it's well worth kind of trying to have a look at.
Excellent.
I must admit, I don't know too much about Ludo. Actually, I don't know anything about Ludo.ai, but it always fascinates me when .ai is part of a product, brand or definition. Because at the end of the day, AI is yet another tool. It's not a solution. It's just a tool to solve a problem. And I don't know, I'm waiting for the day where Unreal is going to rebrand themselves to Unreal.RedBlackTree, and maybe Unity will be Unity.QuickSort. So it's fascinating when AI becomes such a central focus of a product image.
I have the page open in the background here, and apparently it's an AI brainstorming partner. I don't know what that means, but that's what Ludo is.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, you never know. I mean, certainly AI is going to play a bigger role in a lot of these tools in the future. We'll see.
And that's kind of where I go to, like, when you look at the cloud service providers, we tend to think of tools as kind of being client side, but really the biggest tool, the biggest friend of all the game developers, especially for multiplayer, mainly for multiplayer, is the cloud, and they're continually progressing on what you can do on the cloud side. For example, something we've been using very extensively the last couple of years is Kubernetes clusters and containerization. Again, stuff that's just really made massive leaps. And on the cost side of running a multiplayer game, just much more cost effective than virtual machines. So, you know, this is kind of like, when you look at kind of the trend, I think general tools is saving money for development, right? So you can spend it on better artists and things that you can't just throw a tool at, you know?
Well, great. Well, I think with that, I think we have come to the end of our panel. We don't have any more audience questions at this point. Maybe they're suffering from track fatigue after a long afternoon or a long day. Who knows?
Or they're all Googling.
They're all Googling. Yeah, they're still looking at Ludo AI. So, well, thank you all for this. It was a really interesting session. Thank you for all your insights and wisdom.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate.
See you soon.
Thanks all.
All right.